Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming back. This is our final session of this two-day event. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. As a reminder, we are sharing comments and questions via the chat. So I believe everybody should have chat enabled. And so if you have questions throughout, please drop those in chat and we will go over those at the end. This afternoon, I would like to welcome Dr. Daniela Sideri and Dr. Antoinette Foster. They are going to be giving a closing keynote entitled Beneath the Surface, Shattering Illusions and Embracing Transformative Review. And embracing transformation in peer review. Before we get started and before I introduce them, I would like to let you know that Dr. Sideri and Dr. Foster ask that the content from their presentation not be live shared on social media with direct quotes attributed to them. And in particular for Twitter/X, given the latest changes to their policies as it relates to privacy, security, and moderation, they are not comfortable having their talk or pieces of it that might be taken out of context posted on social media. So I would ask that you not live tweet this session. Please keep that in mind as we go through. Okay, I would like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Daniela Sideri is the co-founder and director of Pre-Review, an organization with the mission to bring more equality and transparency to the evaluation of research content, giving systematically excluded researchers better ways to find, train, and contribute to peer review. And as the Director of Community Transformation, Dr. Antoinette Foster co-founded and currently co-directs the Racial Equity and Inclusion Center at Oregon Health Science University. There, she aims to directly impact personal and interpersonal racism by empowering community members to become leaders of change. So at this point, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Dr. Sideri and Dr. Foster. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks you all for being here. Antoinette, I'll share this first part and then we'll switch, and I know that you are going to introduce yourself. So just give me 1 second. Okay. Let me share, and please do tell me if there's anything wrong. Do you see the main?
It's the white screen.
It's a white screen. Why? It did this okay, it did the first time. So now probably if we try again, we'll get better again, hopefully. What this tool is. Whiteboard Zoom. Why does it say whiteboard Zoom? Okay.
Let's see. I'm looking to see.
Because I pressed on whiteboard. Okay, sorry.
Okay. You're fine.
It is interesting that changed to being again. Okay, give me 1 second. See, I should have. We just tested it, I promise you. Okay, share again.
I was going to say, I saw it. I can verify it's there.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah, there we go. We got it now.
And do you see a full screen right now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, well, thanks again. Let's get started.
So as Chris generously introduced me, my name is Antoinette Foster. First and foremost, I'm a daughter, an aunt, a friend, a partner, and a dog mom. Those are my parents on the screen to the left and my little dog on the left as well. I'm a Black Latina that's originally from Denver, which is the picture on the bottom, and I now live in Portland, Oregon. I'm also a trained neuroscientist and the director of community transformation at Oregon Health and Science University. And on that note, everything that I share today are thoughts of my own and not a reflection of the stance of our university.
Thank you, Antoinette. And now Hello, everyone. I'm Daniela Saderi. Thank you, Chris, for introducing myself. I use she, her pronouns. I came to, finally, here we go. I came to Portland, Oregon in 2012 from Italy, where I was born and grew up, to pursue a PhD in neuroscience, also at Oregon Health and Science University. Antoinette and I know from grad school. And this is me in the lab. Also, towards the end of my PhD, I was very lucky to come across the open science movement and a very global community. Many of you are probably here of change catalyzers in the space of open science and scholarship. And I also got an opportunity to be an open science fellow for Mozilla, the Mozilla Foundation. And so that gave me even more opportunity to travel around the world and meet a lot of the people that I consider some of the best people I know today, including Dr. Monica Granados and Dr. Samantha Hindle. Sam and Monica and I make up the leadership team of Pre-Review. I'm the co-founder and director. So as soon as I finished my PhD, decided to dive in full-time and working at Pre-Review. I also am a wife and a mom of two children, and one that you can imagine which one kept me up at night all last night. So hopefully you can be patient if I cross some words today. Okay. Both Antoinette and I still live in Portland, Oregon, where we got our PhD. And we would like to acknowledge the original inhabitants and traditional village sites of the land the Portland metro area occupies: the Multnomah, the Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, Wasco, and many indigenous nations of the Willamette Valley and Columbia River Plateau. And we want to take this opportunity to thank the original creators of this land and to acknowledge that colonialism is not an event of the past, but is an active and ongoing project. Throughout this talk, we will talk about our pathway to work towards transformative change. And we hope that with this work impacts all oppressive systems with racism, colonialism centered throughout. And without that work towards transformative change, these statements will remain only statements without any change. So we hope that we can move towards that. The topics that we're set to talk about today include elements of our history that are inherently traumatic. So we hope that we will prioritize yourself, your well-being, and you feel free to exit the talk at any moment. Also mention again, we would appreciate if you refrain from posting our quotes or snippets from the talk on social media. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's get started. The consensus of the scientific literature is that Native Americans have a unique romance with alcohol and conclude that as high as 95% drink alcohol with a very high rate linked to suicide ideation. You may be wondering where this quote comes from. If I read it without knowing the source, I'd guess it comes from a very opinionated blog or perhaps Twitter or X. But what I would have never guessed is that it came from an article published in a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Systems and Integrative Neuroscience, to be precise. And then probably my next guess would be, well, maybe it was published back in the day when, a lot of questionable science passed through the peer review system, but nope. This was published in 2018, so just 5 years ago. And in fact, this is the opening statement of the article and just the beginning of a very interesting journey if you decide to read this manuscript. This article, in fact, goes on to say that there is something inherent about alcoholism in Native American people, basically describing that they're genetically predisposed to alcoholism, and the solution they put forward to prevent suicide in these populations is to genetically screen their children. Yes. So if it is not immediately apparent why this is both racist and scientifically flawed, hopefully that will become more clear throughout this talk. A question that we can ask now, though, is how does such a racist and scientifically flawed study make it to my desk. Well, this manuscript was published, which means that at least one editor must have read it and thought it was sound science, relevant to the journal's audience and worth putting through the peer review system. Which also means that at least two other people, presumably researchers in a similar field of study, read this manuscript and thought it was worth publishing. And maybe before that, as we can imagine, or we can kind of guess from the acknowledgement session, oops, I went one through. Sorry, before that, we can imagine that some colleagues have seen a version of this manuscript, perhaps in a conference or a department meeting. And as we can presume from the acknowledgement session, this research was funded, meaning that some variation of this research succeeded through the grant review process. So the publication system, in our view, has failed at multiple levels to recognize the issues within the study and to prevent its dissemination. But the publication system does not have a mind of its own. The publication system is made of and by people, all individuals with their own beliefs, assumptions, and values as they're shaped by our culture, the society around us, and our education system. Now, for a moment, let's take a step back and ask ourselves, what is science? Or to make it broader, what is scholarship? And here is where sometimes I feel like one of the biggest lies that I was told during my scientific training, one that I every day have to be intentional about unlearning, is that science is supposed to be, supposed to be this objective and clear method of producing knowledge. And I don't remember questioning science and the scientific method being ever discussed. So becoming consciously aware that science is made of people, that people are biased, and therefore science and scholarship can also be biased, is a very liberating realization. And as people, scientists too live and have lived in a world where we have been socialized within oppressive systems of patriarchy, heteronormativity, colonialism, racism, and white supremacy culture. And in fact, the point that we're going to try to make today is that science and scientific practices have not only evolved in parallel with a history dominated by oppression and inequities, but have actively contributed to legitimizing practices of systemic discrimination, exploitation, and even extermination of entire groups of people. And actually, to this day, we can dare to say that science and scientific practices do thrive on exclusion as an indicator of excellence and see labor as a commodity. And once we make this connection, thinking that these oppressive systems don't affect us and our processes in science and scholarship becomes simply impossible. So our understanding of the world at the individual level informs the way that we do science and research at every level of the research cycle. And because we have all been socialized in these systems, racism, colonialism, and many others, our beliefs and our assumptions and our values, as they're influenced by those systems, can show up within research wherever there is subjectivity. And subjectivity is everywhere. We scientists decide the questions we ask, how we design our study, who we allow to participate, how we collect materials and data, how we interpret the results, who we cite, how and where we publish. And us as editors and reviewers are also called to make judgments about the decisions of our colleagues, as we have the power to decide whose and what knowledge is made available to others. So we're here today to try to think about what can we do about this in the context of our personal growth and our growth and collective growth in this field. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Antoinette.
Thank you, Daniela. And so today we're asking the question, how do we create equity in peer review? And for the past 8 years, I've helped different institutions and programs ask similar questions. And what I've noticed is that people enter our session typically looking for a rather fast answer, a fast solution. I've noticed that folks tend to focus on where do we go from here? And they skip the step about how did we get here? Where do we go from here focuses on a solution. And how did we get here focuses on an understanding. And I have to say that I think that we have this order backwards. To solve a problem, and that's any problem, we have to first understand and then solve. Before we think of solutions, we have to understand the problem, its origins and its nature, understand where it came from, why it was developed, who developed it, and how. We have to understand the history of systemic inequities and how that's changed over time in order to understand how the problem exists today. Without this understanding, we're like a leaf that doesn't understand that we're attached to a tree. We don't understand that we've evolved from something else. And this is critical because without that understanding, we oftentimes will experience resistance to the solution once we hear it. We create more harm while we're trying to implement a solution, or we miss the necessary nuance that we need when we're trying to implement that solution. However, with this understanding, not only do we just clearly deepen our understanding of the problem, and we're able to attune to the ways that these problems show up around us, but we deepen an understanding of ourselves, who we are as people in relation to one another. In part because we are a manifestation of the past. We are the present day iteration of our ancestors. Additionally, once we gain this foundation, we have a knowledge base that is transferable. And so by deepening your understanding of systemic inequities in general, you can start to see patterns not only in peer review, as we'll talk today, but everywhere, because it's everywhere. And so what I hope to do today is to provide a bit of that foundational understanding. Untangling the ways that these systems manifest is a process that requires continuous education, a lifetime of deep introspection. And I start this out as an invitation to be on a journey of understanding both self and societal discovery. The information we go over today might be old to some and it might be new to others, and that's great. If it's new information, then I welcome you into this space. And if it's old, I hope that we're still able to learn something together and that you feel comfortable to simply exist in a space while others are learning beside you. And so today we're going to talk about three main points. The first one, as you might imagine, is how we got here. So how did we get to this place where it's critical to talk about systemic inequities, or as we'll refer to them in the rest of this talk as systemic oppression? How did we get to a place where we have to talk about systemic oppression in scientific research, peer review, and publishing? We'll also talk about ways that systemic oppression shows up in research and publishing. And lastly, we're going to end by highlighting an essential process for those who are interested in first understanding, then addressing the ways that these inequities show up around them. So we're going to start with how did we get here? And let's begin by detailing or defining a few words that we're going to use frequently throughout this time together. The first term that we've already used, but we want to define a system of oppression. And so when we say this, we're referring to discriminatory institutions, structures, norms, policies, and practices embedded into our society and used to oppress a group of people. To the left, you'll see several examples of different systems of oppression. These are only a few, but there are many more that exist. Throughout this talk, we'll discuss examples of how many of these systems can act independently and in conjunction to impact research production, publishing, and peer review. And specifically for this space, we're going to have a deeper focus on two systems in particular, which is the system of racism and the system of colonialism. When I say racism, I'm referring to a system rooted in a racist foundation and is composed of intersecting, overlapping, and codependent racist institutions, policies, practices, ideas, and behaviors that give an unjust amount of resources, rights, and power to white people while denying them to people of color. And when I'm referring to colonialism, or when I say colonialism, I'm referring to a policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. It involves justifying the occupation and exploitation of indigenous land and the maintenance of unequal relationships between natives and non-natives. And so both of these definitions allude to different aspects of a system. It involves people, practices, and policy. To fully understand either of these systems, let's break it down into their individual parts, and we'll use the system of racism as an example. When we think of systemic racism or a system of racism, we can think of it as manifesting within two main categories. Systemic racism either deals with who we are within ourselves and with each other, or how we build who we are into what we do. When we look at this first category, we find two parts, personal and interpersonal. The term personal racism is defined as individual values, beliefs, thoughts, prejudices, and ideas that support racism. Interpersonal racism is more focused on the expression of racism between individuals. And these racist thoughts and behaviors are what most of us think of when we say the term racism. And in fact, we've been socialized and typically explicitly taught that these are the only forms of racism that exist. However, this is only part of it. And the other part covers how we build who we are into what we do, which houses institutional racism and structural racism. Institutional racism referring to the discriminatory treatment, policies, and practices within organizations and institutions that support racism. And structural racism referring to the historical, cumulative, and ongoing effect of a system in which public policies, institutional practices, and other norms perpetuate group inequality. And so when we're talking about a system, we're referring to these four components and the way that these four components intersect, overlap, and are codependent. And you can dub in any system of oppression here. They all have the same basic four ingredients. And like all of the four components here intersect, overlap, and are codependent, so are all of the systems of oppression. So what I mean by that is, for instance, racism acts to hold up colonialism, colonialism acts to hold up patriarchy, and so on. They're interconnected. And so now that we know the ingredients of the system and what we mean by the definitions, or what we mean by the terms that we'll be frequently referring to, let's focus on the origin of both the system of racism and colonialism. And I want to note that there are many colonial projects that exist around the world. And so for our purposes, we're going to focus mainly on the colonial project that was started on the land that we currently occupy now. And I'm not sure where folks are tuning in from, but the land that I'm currently occupying is the US. And so that's what we'll focus on. And in the US, the racial project could not exist without the colonial project. And the colonial project would not exist as we know it without the racial project. And if that doesn't make sense, hopefully it will in a few slides. And so what's the origin of the system of racism and colonialism? As we go through this history, please know that we aim to have a trauma-informed response, but this history is still inherently traumatic. And so I just want to remind folks to take care of yourself and feel free to exit when you need to. So because all history and timelines are interconnected, we could start earlier than this, but for the sake of our time, we're going to start our historical journey in 1453 and focus on two individuals, a Portuguese writer named Gomes de Zuara, who was hired to write a biography for Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry was the first major slave trader to exclusively enslave and trade African people to Portugal. According to the renowned historian Dr. Ibram Kendi, Zuara chronicles and glorifies Prince Henry's voyage that was taken a decade before in his writings. Dr. Kendi explains that this marks the first time that Europeans sailed to sub-Saharan Africa to seize captives directly, rather than buying sub-Saharan captives through North African middlemen. During that voyage, Zuara writes, "We already have our cargo, which was seals, skins, and oil, but how fair of a thing would it be if we, who've come to this land for a cargo of such petty merchandise, were to meet with good fortune and bring back the first captives before the presence of our prince?" Although the raid that followed resulted in less than 12 African captives, Zuara writes that Prince Henry had joy, not so much for the number of captives taken, but for the prospect of other countless captives that could be taken. While describing the resulting auction of enslaved peoples in Portugal, Zuara classifies people with various shades of skin and claims that all of these people, quote unquote, lived like beasts, and that they had no understanding of good, but only knew how to live in bestial sloth. And he would essentially go on to conclude that through Prince Henry's benevolence, the captives would be saved through their captivity and brought to Christianity. Zuara's writing, which provided justification for the enslavement of darker-skinned individuals, was widely circulated in Portugal and spread to other European countries well into the 1500s. According to Dr. Kendi, Zuara was the first articulator of a racist idea by combining all of the different African ethnic groups that Prince Henry enslaved into one group, and then describing that group of people as inferior. Dr. Kendi claims that this is the origin of the racist notion of Blackness. And although Zuara did not explicitly detail this, by creating Blackness, Zuara also created whiteness. I know most of us have heard these types of descriptions of African inferiority before. However, what we may be less familiar with is that this narrative of Africans as subhuman is rampant well before the systematic colonization of North America, which started in 1942, and before the enslavement of the transatlantic slave trade, which started in 1526. And so the justifications and beliefs were already on deck, so to speak. So why share the story here? The first reason is to really drive home the idea of what we mean when we say that race is a social construct and a colonial construct. This means that although the impacts of racism are very real, the creation of race was a made-up concept to justify colonization and slavery. Race is a false classification of people with no biological or scientific truth. The second reason we share the story is to address a common racial myth. When we think about this history, we often say things like, oh, well, these people were just a product of their time. And we're usually suggesting that these beliefs were rampant throughout society and that these beliefs are what led to the racist behavior. However, as Dr. Kendi points out, we have this cause and effect relationship backwards. This narrative or belief was created in order to excuse the behavior that was already being executed. The belief was used to justify the exploitation in order to exploit, make money, and hoard power. The exploitation came first, and then the justification. When we understand that it was the behavior first, it starts to sink in even further that the creation of race has always been about power, not just misguided beliefs. This type of behavioral justification continues throughout the systematic colonization of North America and continues as the system of chattel slavery was developed. Exploitation is what folks ultimately wanted, so the racial beliefs were created as a justification. And now we're in 1526 in our timeline, and the first colonial settlement was established on this land in 1585, and the legalization of slavery as an institution happened in 1641. In 1662, the Virginia Grand Assembly states that children inherit the status of their mother, meaning that if she is free, they are born free, and if she is enslaved, they are born enslaved. This law created created a unique mechanism of forced, perpetual, and intergenerational enslavement with no way out for women or their children. And of course, after one generation, this applies to everyone that society deemed as Black. And 3 years later, after this law was created, the first scientific publication was released by the Royal Society of London. Fast forward to 1831, and we see the beginning of the Trail of Tears, which occurred from 1831 to 1850. Here, the colonizers' goal was to ethnically cleanse indigenous people through genocide and force removal from their native lands, affecting approximately 100,000 indigenous people from the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and other nations. This forced march and relocation to the Oklahoma Territory impacted and controlled Native reproduction by disrupting traditional pregnancy routes and separating children from their parents, and genocide. And if you recall, I mentioned that the racial project could not exist without the colonial project, and the colonial project as we know it would not exist without the racial project. And so to put that in a different way, if the goal was to ultimately make money and slavery was the vehicle, then the vehicle needs a land to travel on. Racism and slavery cannot happen without the land. And the seizure of land, as we understand it today, could not have happened without racism and slavery. On this land, these two systems are intimately connected. And 1 year before what is recognized as the end of the Trail of Tears, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, otherwise known as AAAS, was established, with Charles Darwin's Origin of Species being published 1 year after that. During this time, we'll also see the beginning of what would be termed Indian residential schools. From 1819 to 1969, hundreds of thousands of Native children were required to be forcibly removed from their homes and placed into residential schools operated by the federal government and churches. This was a project of forced assimilation, which means that this was a project to force Native children to become white. This represents a key tool of the colonial project, which is to brainwash the colonized into believing that they are indeed inherently wrong, that they are uncivilized, that everything that they know, their beliefs, their religious practices, their food, everything about them needs to change. They were penalized for doing anything that resembles their own cultural practices and made to cut their hair, which is a spiritual assault. And many never returned home or were buried at schools in unmarked grave without that knowledge from their own parents. And these images break my heart to know that the forced separation of these children from their parents ended after my own mother was born. And while slavery was outlawed in 1863, the system of racism was still under development, or was still developing, I should say. While J.C. Pritchard, a famous anthropologist in the 1800s, said that it was obvious that the savage races could not be saved and that this was the nature of law, Frederick Farr lectured on the aptitude of races, and he divided people into three groups. One, savage, which would, in his definition, include all Africans, indigenous people, people of color, with the exception of the Chinese. The second was semi-civilized, which included only Chinese people who, in his opinion, were once civilized, but now their society is in arrested development. And of course, then the civilized group was European, Aryan, and Semitic peoples. In the 1800s, there was a proliferation of publishing companies. By creating publishing systems to share their ideas, the amount of quote-unquote scholarly contributions expanded. As Europeans continued colonial expansion and came into contact with indigenous peoples from all over the world, indigenous peoples were disappearing, in part due to genocide and in part due to viral and bacterial spread. And many publications were focused on trying to explain this phenomenon, as well as attempting to draw distinctions between different quote-unquote racial groups. Many 19th century scientists would use Darwin's theory of evolution to push social Darwinism, which suggests that the biological concept of natural selection and the survival of the fittest applies to people, with the idea being that those with wealth and power are inherently strong and fit, and those without it are inherently weak. That those who are most harmed by racism and colonialism were harmed because they were inherently less fit to survive. Again, this is justification for behavior. And in fact, it was Charles Darwin's own cousin, Francis Galton, would coin the term that reflected the belief in social Darwinism. This term that most of us has heard before is eugenics. Galton defined this as the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. He claimed that disease, health, social, and intellect, so that disease, health, and intellect came from heredity and race, and therefore humans could be improved via selective breeding. With the establishment of European and American publishing systems and the increased ease at which one could communicate scientific and pseudoscientific ideas, science and scientific communication became the new legitimizing agent for cruel treatment and exploitation became the new legitimizing agent for the cruel treatment from exploitation to genocide of Black, Brown, Jewish people, people with disabilities, and LGBTQ+ or queer individuals. Although many of us are familiar with eugenics being used as a legitimizing agent in Germany, this framework was utilized within the US as well. Within the US, there were and still are fears of race mixing and retaliation against white people. Therefore, eugenics was the framework that was used to lobby for social legislation to keep racial and ethnic groups separated by any means necessary. And those means spanned from institutionalization to forced sterilization. These ideas were given the stamp of validation from both the researcher and the publisher. And so we created this timeline to point out two things. One is to highlight the ways that these inequities caused by racism and colonialism have always and intrinsically been and inseparably tied to the establishment of the US. And when we can accept that these systems were created alongside and in order to establish the US, we can begin to more easily understand how they've been woven into the fabric of what we've built before and what we build today. We move from asking questions like, is there racism or colonialism here, to what are the ways in which racism and colonialism show up here? And that shift in perspective opens the door for a deeper understanding interrogation. The second reason we created this timeline is to point out that while the system of racism and colonialism in the US was forming, so was the establishment of the system for communication for European and American scientific discovery. They are overlapping and interconnected timelines. Where Christianity served as the early legitimizing agent, about 200 years after the systematic colonization of North America began, many people of color had already been converted to Christianity. Therefore, religion became the weaker legitimizing agent for the brutality of slavery and colonization. However, the desire for the legitimization didn't disappear, it just shifted to use biological, zoological, and botanical theories. And so the interweaving of racism, colonialism, and scientific discovery and communication was plainly clear in early scientific literature and publications. And although some of these ideas have been appropriately deemed as pseudoscience now, we still see publications that perpetuate many of these ideas today. And so that was a little bit of the history about how we got here. And what I want to do is share some examples of how this shows up in research with a focus on biomedical research, since Daniela and I are both trained neuroscientists, and that's what we're most familiar with. And although many of these studies we'll discuss may not be directly tied to your scholarly subject of interest or the scholarly subject of interest of the folks that you work with, I can promise you that unfortunately, racism and colonialism shows up in that field too. And so what we're hoping is that some of the lessons you hear today are transferable to your field. And if they aren't, I would just like you to know that, and if they aren't, and you would like to know how these systems of oppression show up in your favorite field of interest, it's typically pretty easy to find out just by searching, racism in XYZ field. And so the two studies that we will be discussing are outlined in a review entitled Modern Day Drapetomania, Calling Out Scientific Racism. The first study that we will look at was published in 2020, and it was interested in investigating racial variations of a protein called TMPRSS2A, and interested in the expression, interested in RNA expression. And so this protein is a transmembrane protein that is expressed in the nose, and it allows COVID-19 to bind onto the receptor. And so this was a single figure publication, which makes sense because given that time, in 2020, many single figure publications were being published. So I'm just pointing that out to say this is the only thing that they looked at. And the investigators had people enter into the study and self-identify with the following racial categories: Asian, Black, Latino, mixed, and white, all from the New York area. They did nasal swabs, and then they did RNA-seq analysis to count gene expression. And what they found out was that the group of individuals who identified as Black had a higher TMPRSS2 RNA expression, so that expression of that protein, but looking at the RNA in their noses. The conclusion was that there was higher nasal expression of this protein, and that this higher nasal expression of TMPRSS2, and this may contribute to the higher burden of COVID amongst Black individuals. So in essence, the paper suggests that the genetic variation within racial groups may contribute to COVID-19's disproportionate infection and death rates in Black individuals. And so there's a central issue here. It shows up in this paper's research question, it's repeated in the methods, and it leads to a poor scientific conclusion. The authors are practicing what's known as racial essentialism, which is the belief that socially constructed racial categories reflect inherent biological differences and that races are fundamentally genetically different. Similar to what's displayed on the screen here, with each of these bubbles representing a different racial group, as you can see, the different racial groups in this picture look different, but within there's not a lot of genetic variation. So this belief says that each racial group has an essential biological, oftentimes genetic difference. It also suggests that there's uniformity, typically genetic uniformity, within each discrete racial group. This idea assumes that each racial group shares genetic ancestry, since swapping genes through our ancestors is how genes are shared. But the problem here is that race is not a biological category, and that race and genetic ancestry are not interchangeable concepts. Remember, race is a socio-political construct, not a biological one. We've known that race does not have an biological underpinning for 70 years. In fact, in 2023, the phase 1 of the Human Genome Project demonstrated that humans populating the Earth today are on average 99.9% identical at the DNA level. There is no genetic basis for race. Genetic variation actually looks more like this. Although genetic similarities do cluster within racial groups, variation between racial groups is small, and variation within a single racial group is large. So to put that in a different way, the genetic variation within, let's say, people who identify as Black is very large, and the genetic variation between Black and white folks is very small, for instance. And so people often assume, oh, well, then they must be studying the effect of a geographic region. Maybe there are geographic differences, and that's why we're seeing these genetic differences based on geography. But similar to race, there's more genetic variation within geographic regions than between geographic regions. And although race and ethnicity may correlate with genetic ancestry, and race may capture information about the presence of certain genetic variants, ancestry is overall the better predictor. Why? Because we're looking at genetic lineages of people who actually exchange genetic information rather than pseudoscientific categories of people with substantial genetic variation within that population. So for instance, take me. I'm Latina, I'm Black, and if I was one of the people in that previous study, I would categorize myself as Black. As far as I know, my ancestry has been here for centuries, and I do not know what, from the Black side of my family, what our country of origin is. And my friend, who's also in this study, is a first-generation Ghanaian, and they also categorize themselves as Black for this study. She likely has a genetic lineage that's dissimilar to mine. Our ancestors may have never shared genetic information, but the researchers would force our genetic data together along with the other 45 self-identified Black people in that study and say that we're the same racial category, and then go and draw correlations from that. And these correlations can have dastardly impacts for Black people in this example, but dastardly impacts for everyone. In contrast, when we study ancestry, it's a fixed characteristic on the genome that's passed down through actual gene mixing. Racial essentialism is dangerous, and moreover, it's bad science. It's just not good science, bad science. However, we see the application of racial essentialism time and time again. And so, for instance, there was this review that was published in 2021 discussing the racial disparities in congenital heart disease, otherwise known as CHD. This paper stated that racial disparities were due to quote unquote possible genetic disparities within racial groups, and that quote unquote individuals belonging to races are assumed to differ at a genome level. So this entire paper is based on the assumption that there is a difference at the genome level, which we've already discussed is incorrect. And it was wild to read this paper because that's literally the belief of racial essentialism, that assumption that there's an inherent biological difference between the socially fabricated idea of race. And so the authors repeatedly lumped minorities together, as they termed it, which in this context meant Black and Hispanic people, suggesting that CHD mortality may be quote unquote correlated to genetic variations to specific to minority genomes amongst other potential causes. And as you can see from the figure, ethnic minorities were grouped together next to the control subjects. And based on what I'm seeing in the image, my guess is that the control subjects here are white. They're baseline, they're normal. Things that are outside of whiteness are a deviation from the norm. So I want to ask, if race isn't biological, what might we be studying when we try to tie disease to differences between races? Given what we've discussed, when we're trying to tie disease to genetic differences between races, we're not studying the effects of race. We're studying the effects of racism. Environmental racism, chronic stress related to the experience of racism, different access to medical care, different treatment within medicine, socioeconomic status, and more. What I find most disturbing about this paper is that the authors suggest that we should explore gene editing technologies as a therapeutic option that could ultimately make it possible to identify the causes of racial disparities and find effective treatments to reduce them. And although the authors acknowledge that there are racial disparities, and they acknowledge that correlations to CHD outcomes, such as the role of maternal health conditions and environmental exposure to air pollutants and pesticides, do add to CHD, or can contribute to CHD, they don't connect that there are structural and systemic racial injustices like environmental racism that drives exposure to these risk factors. Instead of addressing those systemic injustices that create the disparities in the first place, they suggest gene editing along racial lines. And this raises eugenic alarm bells for me. Although I find that unbelievable, it's all too common to attribute disease to genetic factors while largely ignoring the sociopolitical factors that contribute to health outcomes. DNA Navajo geneticist and bioethicist Dr. Sosi points out an important point that the larger medical and scientific community overlooks often, which is that genetics don't occur in a vacuum. Not everything that's genetically mediated causes disease, But it's easy to think about that in these terms because this is the type of biological information that's fairly accessible to researchers. However, Dr. Sosi reminds us that health and disease is complex. It's impacted by your genetics, but also your environment, behavior, and medical interventions. In fact, every circle on the screen impacts the other because they're all interconnected. We know that the environment can have a direct impact on gene expression, but all of these factors together are harder to account for compared to simply doing genetic testing. In the context of racism and colonialism, science and medicine, we have to consider and remember that the effects of these systems have an effect on health outcomes. And she gives us two pertinent examples that demonstrate the necessity of considering gene and environment interactions through a decolonized lens. The first example is alcoholism. You may remember this quote from the beginning. This article was published in 2018. It practices racial essentialism, and it goes on to suggest that there is something inherently or genetically different about Native populations that results in alcoholism and suicidal ideation. In fact, in 2020, there were over 230 publications that were interested in trying to understand why Native peoples are at a greater genetic risk for alcoholism. And I want you to think about the start of our time together. Over the course of 500 years and consecutive generations have lived with trauma. Indigenous people on this land have been forcibly removed, experienced genocide and spiritual trauma. They've had their children taken away from them. They've been taken away from their parents. The list goes on, and it continues to this day. Along with the lack of mental health and preventative services available, there's real intergenerational trauma here. And when we skip all of this, especially with a disease like alcoholism, which we know is highly impacted by the environment, when we go directly to which genes are putting Indigenous people at a higher risk of disease, when we ignore the historical realities, we continue to perpetuate the legacy of racism and colonialism. When we say, think, or publish this behavior, and we say something like it's due to a unique romance between Native peoples and alcohol, while ignoring all of this, we practice racism and colonialism. So it's not just, and again, it's not just unethical or irresponsible research, it's also bad science. It's science that does not interrogate the full scope of reality. It's investigating what we want to see rather than what is. And remember, all of these papers that we shared today were published. They started with a researcher and moved through these levels that it's meant to catch these types of errors. But now it's searchable for you and I to find. And on top of that, these scholarly articles are what other researchers use to confirm their research, perpetuating the problem even further. And so oftentimes when we see the scope of these problems laid out, we feel terribly overwhelmed or helpless, like the problem's too big for us to solve. And so I just want to let us take a collective breath and remind ourselves that there's actually no problem that's too big, that whatever we create, we can change. And so to end our talk, we want to share the process that we have for we want to share the process of collective change. This process helps Daniela and I both feel empowered as we can recognize our own role in this change. And so first know that our values shape our decision. They're a reflection of who we are and of our outcomes, and our outcomes reflect that. We just reviewed how power and greed has been reflected historically. And even though that's been reflected historically, they do not have to determine who we'll be because we get to choose our own values. We can shift what we value and whom we value. And this process starts with ourselves. And what we also know is that what we practice on a small scale is reflected on a large scale. Individual and small group decisions are reflected on a large scale when it's repeated by many over time. People do not come together all at once to decide on one cultural value or a set of cultural values. They're practiced on an individual and small group level, and then it's repeated and scaled. And we know that individuals shape the collective, and that collectively we can shape change. And so if our focus today is shaping change in the scholarly review and publishing world, then we accept that with intention, practice, and understanding, we can shape that change. And regardless of how kind of like hokey it sounds when we say the change starts with you, it's true. All change starts with individuals. And so if we can learn how we've internalized these systems of oppression, and then we understand how that operates around us, we can address that, repeat that, and scale that over time. And this is our power to shift the culture, and in turn, creates a new set of norms, values, and beliefs for the next generation. And so Daniela is going to lead us through a set of questions that we would like to leave you with for both your personal journey and also questions that you can ask for broader collective change.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Antoinette. So yeah, feel free to continue sharing the slides. So we're at the end. and a few things that we want to you to consider reflecting on. So first is a series of questions for you on your personal journey. And first we can start by asking ourselves, which values do I use to drive the decisions I make? Are these values and decisions creating harm to others? How would I know? So this could be, again, applied to our own personal journey, and we can see how that can also be applied in the work that we do. And another question we can ask ourselves is, how much am I willing to understand the problem before investing into solutions? Antoinette just showed us how important it is to understand before. In fact, understand could be considered as the first phase of solution building. So when we all in this room, if there are other people that are trying to bring solutions to their own spaces, it is a really good reminder to me to really stop and think about what is the problem that I'm doing, and come iteratively back to these issues before going into solution. And another question we can ask is, what power do I have to create change? And what we discussed today may leave some of us feeling overwhelmed and thinking eradicating oppression is just too big of a task for me to undertake. And if it's the case, we want to invite you to move past that sense of helplessness and consider for a moment the power you actually hold in your personal and professional lives, because we all have some level of power. And importantly, we can also tap into our collective power by finding and joining like-minded people with whom we can develop trust and drive change. We can also think about, how do we let go of power in favor of others taking charge? And finally, we can think about, how much am I willing to commit to transformative change? And how willing am I to stick around when things get tough, and when I find out that I was actually creating harm, that I was actually wrong all along? Then we have another set of questions for you to consider in your space of finding solutions in your personal workspace. And the first one is, how might we be repeating systemic oppression in our solutions? And of course, if we're not aware of systemic oppression and how it shows up, we're not equipped to answer this question. So we need to take a step back and deepen our personal understanding. We can also ask, how is the legacy of colonialism and racism influencing who makes decisions? Not if, but how. And who is left out? So who usually makes decisions are those who we deem as experts. And even in the process of peer review, when we think about this a lot of peer reviews, like what expertise do we seek as editors looking for reviewers? But also as researchers, like whose expertise do we seek as colleagues and advisors for our research projects? In the alcoholism and genetic traits of indigenous people example, how many of those 230 publications do you think operated in community with indigenous population? If they had, perhaps those studies would have not been taken in the same way. How do we ensure these questions and conversations are prioritized in the spaces we're in? And finally, what does my team need to do to learn humanity-based and equitable decision-making? How do we create accountability amongst ourselves and others? And how do we decenter our own personal perspective and importance and practice valuing others in our everyday practice? Thank you for that. I hope that this was perhaps not a session you expected for peer review, but we would like to welcome the Q&A session. Perhaps we don't have as much time as we plan to. We have some questions for you that we can leave on the screen in case this can help guide the discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. I think leaving those these questions up actually might be good for our attendees, so that they have the opportunity to come perhaps reflect on those and offer some comments. Connor in the chat posted a question, and he asked whether or not these and Daniel, so I'll just reiterate for those that might not be watching that these articles have been retracted or annotated for context in any way. And as Daniela reiterates that no, they're not, not that you know of. Anne says that she feels hopeful that individuals can make personal decisions that make a larger difference. mean, I remember hearing in school when I was growing up that indigenous populations, Native American populations were more prone to alcoholism, that genetically. So that was something that we learned. I'm pretty sure in high school biology that they talked about genetics and predispositions there. So this is a really interesting talk that kind of made me rethink my own, what I have been taught and how that relates to how I move in my own spaces. I do have a question, I guess, and I don't know, I don't want to put this on you in terms of providing solutions, but so if, for example, one of the attendees is doing a peer review and comes across something that seems like racial essentialism, that seems like it is making assumptions about a particular population, how would you recommend that they proceed? What might be a good step for somebody who is perhaps like maybe not sure or sees something but doesn't know how to call that out or how to bring that to someone's attention? What steps might you recommend?
It's such a good question.
Go ahead, Antoinette.
Yeah. It's such a good question because as reviewers that are now have this information, you are of a minority of scientists or reviewers that have this information. And it's also possible that if this is even getting to your desk, the editors don't know this information. And so there's like a double level of education almost that you'll have to do. And so when you respond, I want you to think about it like it's any other scientific point that someone is making in a paper that is unsound. You bring up that it's an unsound conclusion or an unsound practice, not scientifically backed practice. You might point, just like you would with any other review, you would point to other scientific literature that backs up your point. You might have to explain this to the editor of what this is and why it's dangerous to publish it. But I think that there's enough information out there that kind of explains what this problem is, that it's not just your opinion, but there's real literature, real study that backs that up. Daniela, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I just thought about, so when we started doing some of this work was for a workshop for the American Association of OBGYNs that invited us to give a workshop on peer review. And we have examples of here is how you can provide this kind of feedback. And for example, for some of the papers that we shared, the gut would say, like, I'm not gonna waste my time here. Like, this is just, if you already know it, just such bad. But like, if you actually want to commit to writing the review, things like asking yourselves, like have even communities that have been engaged, in indigenous communities. We skipped a lot of examples that we found. Have they been put in consultation with the author? So like there were certain things that would like you can write to suggest that the authors would do, but the problem is that those practices, they don't even, we look for ethical things, we look for ethical approval, but those are not the kind of ethical approvals that we're looking for. So I think that even in training peer reviewers, rethinking about what is that as a reviewer we're looking for, and not rethinking, but really expanding. It is bad science. It's just at the point here, it's not political. It's like, it's just wrong. And the Genome Project, they have a whole series of talks around this and how like they are saying stop in 2003. But these articles continue to come out, and our search didn't take too long. I want you to know it took minutes to find a lot of examples, which is alarming.
And these are conversations that ideally we wouldn't be having only on the back end once we get these types of papers. Hopefully these are conversations that publishing houses, journals are having before, so that they can think about, how do we plan for when we do get publications like this? Are our editors trained to know how to filter this out? What policies do we have in place to be able to address this? And if you work at a publishing company or with a journal that doesn't have any of this, then it might be useful to start the conversation, grab a collective of people who might be like-minded, and then start to try to have that conversation at your respective journal as well.
Yeah, we spoke yesterday, in some of yesterday's talks, we spoke a little bit about how publishers in particular are starting to provide guidelines for reviewers in terms of what they might want, perhaps establishing a rubric or setting some guidelines about these are the things we want you to touch on. And so that seems like a really ideal place for publishers to perhaps include a statement or what their policies might be as they're working with both reviewers and authors. Do you know of any publishers that are currently have included that kind of language or providing that kind of guidance?
Yeah, so we worked with Dr. Ebony Carter, who is the editor of equity. I forgot her actual title. It's like the editor-in-chief for of equity, and she's leading. And I'll find the link and put in the chat. She back about a year ago, and basically they assembled at the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, assembled a steering committee to put together a rubric that was focused on kind of guiding reviewers on how to identify issues with racial inequities in reproductive medicine. And we were brought in as part of this project to give a workshop. And I have to say that in our experience from the perspective of pre-review working with journal, that was one of the experiences that gave me the most hope in terms of actually getting to transformative change. I think they're getting ready to publish some of the results from this first year. And I'll just quickly look for them for the reference.
And one of the things I want to point out about this work is that these guidelines were developed in conjunction with community members that are most impacted by these systems. And that is an essential component, because you don't know what you don't know, but other people do. We, as folks impacted by these systems, we know how they show up. We're very attuned to it. And so having more folks, I mean, we talk about this a lot as a solution, and having more community-centered efforts to bring in community members as the experts of how these systems impact us, because that is an expertise.
Here is the first editorial about their work.
Thank you for sharing that. We are coming up on our time. It's right around 2:30. I don't want to. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But I do want to give, if there's anyone in our audience amongst our attendees, the last opportunity. If you have any final questions or comments, we would happily accept those at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, Eric has said excellent keynote. This is really educational. And it is really interesting. Dr. Foster, I really appreciate you walking us through kind of this evolution and talking about the publications where this first started to appear, to really provide that grounding of how we ended up where we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you and the attendees being open to that information. I know it can be challenging information to hear, but it's that, again, that understanding is so pivotal for us to be able to find solutions moving forward. So thank you all for being open to that and receptive.
Okay, well, thank you. I have one last, if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen quickly. I just want to one last time thank our sponsors. IOP Publishing and Pre-Review both contributed to helping to make today happen, so we are very grateful for their support. And lastly, just a reminder that these recordings, everything has been recorded, and we will make it available on the Charleston Conference YouTube channel in the not too distant future. And just thank you for everyone coming and participating and being here and present. I'm grateful to everybody that was able to join and participate. So thank you very much.